Hello, everybody. Nice to see everybody here. And we're gonna get started here in a second. Originally, we were gonna read a piece out of. I'm Jonathan Lang. For those of you who don't know me, I'm with Metro IAF, and this is our 7th of these weekly reading and reflection meetings, gatherings. So it's nice to see everybody back. Originally we were going to read a piece out of Hannah Arendt on the human condition, and we're going to hold that for next week. And instead we substituted a short reading out of Hannah Arendt's On Violence, an essay on violence. And I'm going to ask Leo to just frame that a little bit because it was his idea to do the substitution. And then we've asked a couple people early to react to it in light of current events and in light of just the reading itself. And then we'll open it up for discussion. So Leo, why don't you talk about why you wanted us to read this week?
Thanks, Jonathan, and welcome to everyone. Again, for those who might not know me, my name is Leo Penta. I am the director of the German Institute for Community Organizing. Have worked in Germany for almost 23 years now, originally from Brooklyn, going all the way back with IAF to the days of East Brooklyn churches, East Brooklyn congregations in the eastern part of Brooklyn. And I suggested this reading today, of course, in light of the events that are playing out in places all over the country, but also internationally, basically as a reaction to a police killing and to a whole series, clearly, of police killings and police violations against Black and brown people. And so I thought that it would be good today, as we take a bit of a step back, as we do in these reflection sessions, to look at something which comes out of an earlier time of great tumult, if you will, and was written by Hannah Arendt in 1969 in a debate in and around the whole question of violence in social protest, but also the question of power with regard to the issue of violence, and both of those in the context ultimately of justice. And so it was written against the background not only of the student revolution, of at least what it was called in part in Europe, but student movements, and the unrest in American cities, particularly, at least for me, the example that I still have in my head, even though I was in high school at the time, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968, and watching on black and white television what was going on outside the convention hall, but also inside the convention hall at that time. So that's the background against which this was written, and it was a reflection in and around. As I said, the essay is called On Violence, and first appeared in the New York Review of Books and later as a small volume. And this is from the very last part of that essay, and is kind of the last piece, which is all about the practical stuff. And I asked you to read a couple of pages where Hannah Arendt clarifies her vocabulary in and around these words that have to do with, in some way, issues of what could be seen as coercion, at least, or what can be seen in one way or another as words that we use to describe what is often lumped together with various words. But she distinguishes very clearly between power, violence, strength, force, and authority. And that's why I gave you those to read. They're in the first couple of, the first 3 pages, really, from an earlier portion of the essay. The last part is all about the idea of, is violence, and in what form is violence a part of social protest? In what way can it be justified? And Arendt's position, to put it in a nutshell, is to say, first of all, power and violence are 2 separate realities, even though they often appear in a form mixed with one another in the world as it is. But they are fundamentally different. And they generally tend to exclude each other, at least in their pure forms. And that's what she's trying to do, is to separate the idea that violence is somehow power made greater through the use of instruments and the use of weapons. And that's what she's trying to think about then in the context of protest and of justice. And one last sentence, and basically what she says is that violence is never legitimate, though it can in some circumstances be justified. Whereas power is always something that is legitimate wherever it shows up, because it is part of the political nature of human beings, and needs that legitimacy out of where people are engaging together. But it is always justified, whereas violence is never justified, in her opinion. So I'm going to stop there. And we asked a couple of people today to give some initial responses, and then just open it up to a discussion and see where that takes us. And so I'd like to ask first Pastor Allen to give us a reflection and a response.
Hello, everybody. And my brain is racing. I read this last night, and I read it again this morning. And I am just reminded, first of all, that I am now officially in the category of the young old. And I keep getting reminded of that by younger colleagues in a loving way. When Barack Hussein Obama was inaugurated, I didn't watch it. And the reason I didn't watch it was because on that day, I was so afraid that he would die. And that may seem totally irrational, but I discovered later that I was not alone. I was so afraid that the United States of America, having done this extraordinary thing, that he would die. And all through his first term, I worried about that. I really did. And so when he came through 2 terms, every time I see him now, I'm like, wow, you actually survived, dude. And so what we got was a delayed response to what happened when he was elected president of the United States. But let me go back. I started with being old for a reason. I was a child in the 60s, and we all know about trauma. I saw 4 assassinations. I am that generation that lived through 4 assassinations. And most white people, and even a few Black people, don't know who the 4th is. They never think about him. But of course, it was President Kennedy, it was Bobby Kennedy, of course, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X, who was significant to my community. And so I grew up with assassinations, and that has scarred me. I know that people sometimes kill people with whom they disagree. My mother asked the question as DC was burning, especially H Street, the letter H Street. And the question she asked was one of self-interest. How is this going to help us? She kept saying that. My stepfather was career military, and he called them all kinds of names. But my mother kept saying, how is this going to help us? We are destroying our own communities. And so here we are, fast forward to 2020, which is just like the shittiest year ever. And there's that question being asked. So I agree that violence is sometimes justified. And I refused on Sunday to say to my congregation, I will not condemn them. I don't agree with it, and I think they ought to stop. But I will not condemn them. I understand that impulse to tear down and destroy what clearly is not working for us. And so when she writes about I can never say that word, bureaucracy, the bureaucratization, there we go, of human beings, I don't think that too many people have been more victimized by that than Africans in America, especially in the inner cities. There comes a point where something's got to burn. Something has got to be torn down. In my faith tradition, we happen to believe in death and resurrection, death and resurrection, death and resurrection. And so we believe that out of the destruction of what is not good, what is not working, can come new life. So my question is, where's the new life? This difficulty we have with looking at the long term, which she talks about, I mean, it really is about the immediate moment for us. And I think that's why our social policies fail so miserably, because everybody is kicking the can down the road. It's all about the short term. It's about corporations and this quarter's return. It's about, will I get elected 9 months from now? But this notion that we as a collective people can come together and think about 10 years from now, and think about the quality of life for our children, the quality of life for all of us 10 years from now, seems to be missing. And I worry that capacity to think beyond the immediate, beyond the short-term gratification, is just diminished in our society. I understand why things are being torn down and burned, and it has nothing to do with the televisions and the lamps from Target. But what do we build out of this? Which is why I have so enjoyed these noon gatherings, because out of what seems like a very academic exercise, I am convinced that we are going to build something that would not have happened if we hadn't been willing to engage in this way. So I was told I had 3 minutes. I think I've gone beyond the 3 minutes, so I'll shut up now.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Let me introduce Lina to everybody.
Yeah, go ahead. Lina, you want to
And
introduce yourself, or Jonathan, you want to do it? Okay.
Yeah, let me introduce Lina. I met Lina Jamoul, how many years ago, Lina? 20? Yeah, 20. I was organizing in the United Kingdom with what's now called London Citizens or UK Citizens, which is the IAF affiliate in the UK. And Lina was a grad student at Queen Mary, and she was a leader in our living wage campaign on the campus, working for a living wage with the custodial help and the other help on the campus there, where she was getting her graduate degree. And then she came and worked for us as an organizer. First an intern with Build, and then an organizer in Chicago with the IAF, and then back to the UK as an organizer with Citizens UK. And so I asked Lina if she would be willing to, and during all this period of time, somehow she managed to get a PhD. But I asked Lina during all, if she would respond to the Hannah Arendt piece, and also maybe talk a little bit about what it's feeling like to be in Minnesota. Thank you for doing this, Lina.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to do this. Thank you, Reverend Allen. That was incredibly powerful. And I'm not sure what to share with you. It's kind of pretty raw here. Just to situate myself a little bit here. I live 5 blocks from where George Floyd was murdered. And 2 blocks away from all the devastation and unrest. Friday night was scary, and on Saturday we left our home and came back home Tuesday. Watching people being killed and having to leave home is strikes pretty core in my identity. I happen to come from Syria, where I've been watching countless of Syrians die in a senseless war. So I feel like I'm twice removed from violence, but related to it. And leaving home, my family had to leave our home when I was 7. So leaving home because of violence is fucked up. So the things that the reflections that came to me reading this piece, the one quote, that the first quote that really stood out, I'm going to read it. The practice of violence, like all action, changes the world, but the most probable change is to make it a more violent world. And that's not to condemn violence. That's not to, this threading of neither agreeing with it nor condemning it, because understanding where it comes from, and in understanding where it comes from, having an understanding of what it leads to, which is a more violent world. And that's what we see. That's what we've seen played out in Syria. There is a piece, which I'll type here in the chat a little bit. It's called The Unsexy Truth of Why the Arab Spring Failed. And it's all about the lack of civic infrastructure, the lack of civil society, and the institutional fabric of the Arab world had been hollowed out, not because Arabs can't do democracy, but because it was purposeful and planned and intentional from dictators who wanted to protect power at all costs. So, the other piece that Hannah Arendt ties violence to what she calls a decrease in our faculty of action, in humans' faculty of action. So the ability to come together with others, dream of what a world should look like, and act together to try and make it so. The faculty of action and the decrease of the faculty of action is one of the conditions of violence. And I think we see that played out in Syria. We're seeing it played out in Minneapolis and across the country. The other piece that is striking, so the violence, it's both, towards the end of her piece, she also talks about violence as a way of those in power to protect their power, the use of violence. If there's a decrease in power, the use of violence to kind of defend a decrease in power. So there's this like pressure of violence from both kind of below, because there is a decrease of faculty of action, of not being able to come together, and there's a kind of an incentive of violence from those in power to use violence to retain power. And so kind of both those things happen, kind of creating double conditions at the same time. We tend to focus on the use of violence on the first piece, right? People are so angry, ways to express. There's also a violence of maintaining power, and that's what the fucking Minneapolis Police Department is doing. So, and I apologize for my swearing. And I want to link that to a piece that Hannah Arendt talks about the bureaucracy, the bureaucratization of public life. So I'm going to read this quote. Bureaucracy is the form of government in which everybody is deprived of political freedom, of the power to act. For the rule by nobody is not no rule, but one where all are equally powerless, and we have a tyranny without a tyrant. And just some reflections from Minneapolis. The mayor of Minneapolis last week, on Monday, when he first talked about George Floyd's killing, both the mayor's remarks, the chief of police, who is the first Black chief of police that Minneapolis Police Department has had, and the governor, all came out really strongly against the killing and for police accountability. And the Minneapolis Police Department acted in ways that were completely contrary to what those three leaders were saying. And so there are some of us who believe that the Minneapolis Police Department was acting without, in a bureaucratization of public life, was acting kind of on their own and with their own, in response to an attack on decrease of their power in order to maintain power. And that's part of the equation of the violence too. So sorry I've gone on longer than I'd wanted to, but thanks for the opportunity.
Lina, thanks very much. And I see how painful that obviously is, but thank you for bringing that so close to us today. Many, many thanks, first of all, to everyone who got into this discussion. I know it's not easy to do in light of many of our own personal experiences, but thank you for sharing those. Two things I'd like to just raise up at the end, and then one is in line with some of what has been said, a fearful one, where Hannah Arendt says that the greatest danger would be the transformation of white prejudices into a full-fledged racist ideology for which law and order would indeed become a mere facade. And I'm afraid that that has happened. And that's maybe the key difference to the time when this was originally written, that fear has really come to pass in what we're seeing. The other side is in a certain sense, the hope that Hannah Arendt continually holds out in all of her work, not in the religious terms of resurrection, but certainly in the term of that she coined of natality as central to the human condition, which she contrasts with mortality as the most apolitical thing there can be. You can't do politics if you're not alive. But if you are alive, there's always the possibility of beginning anew. And interestingly enough, when you look back, she draws that out of a quote from St. Augustine, that human beings were created in order that there be a beginning. And so she coins the term natality. And that natality is in fact, I think, what we've been referring to, what we talk about very often as the habit of action and collective action and being able to begin together. And interestingly, Roger, she calls that a miracle. So yeah, there is something miraculous about that, but it's also something that is into a situation which has been reduced to bureaucracy or to non-politicalness or not being political in the sense of what we talked about with Wolin. Politics, as usual, is not our politicalness. It's not our capacity to act. And Arendt says that to expect people who don't have the slightest notion of these things to act is neither realistic nor reasonable. And so we need to kind of go against realism and reasonableness in a certain extent to begin to fortify the habit of action. Because I think the question is going to be, violence is a short-term reaction, and over again, that may be justified in various circumstances. But who do we talk to after some of this is over? After, in a certain sense, the smoke has cleared? Who are the people who are peacefully protesting, for example, and how do we get in touch with some of them? More specifically, I'd like to put a link in the chat to an organization that has been researching this and has some very clear suggestions about how you address the terrible policing situation in so many of our police forces. I think that as we begin to zero in on some of this afterwards, as was just pointed out in the last comment, we need to start to, as we always do, focus on where the structural changes need to be made. And I think this might be an interesting place to start. Finally, a last comment, or better, an announcement for next week, that we will continue reading Hannah Arendt. This time, the reading that was originally scheduled for this week, on action, out of the human condition, and in and around, in fact, action, and the understanding of action, and the understanding of action as the generator of power. And I'd also suggest, if you have the time, to also check out the video link that was provided with the reading for next week, to get a really personal insight into Hannah Arendt. It's a tremendous interview. It's in German, but there are subtitles, so you can understand it. And it was one of the few interviews she actually gave, and it was on German television, roughly around the same time as this essay was written. So I think it's a very interesting piece to give us some background for next week's discussion. And once again, my very great thanks to everyone. I know this is a difficult time, but the fact that we were able to get together in this way, take a bit of a step back, not divorcing ourselves from the realities, but at the same time, I think, provisioning ourselves for what needs to happen very soon after this. So thank you all, and hope to see everyone, or as many as can, next week at this time again.
Leo, thank you for recommending this reading. Julie, thank you for doing the technical part, as always. And Carletta and Lina, thank you for starting the conversation off. We really appreciate it. So be well, everybody, and please be safe.